This is the Economic Club of Florida, a distinguished platform for discussion of the major national issues of the day.
Good afternoon, and we apologize for the delay. We had a technical difficulty on the other end. I want to welcome you to the 527th in our series of Distinguished Speaker programs. I'm Bill Moore, and I have the privilege of serving as your club president. I personally have received positive feedback from members about our virtual meetings. Last week, the board decided to continue to bring you 2 world-class speaker programs a month virtually, and we're working to have one of the 2 meetings with the option of an in-person attendance. In this new virtual format, we're able to bring you world-renowned speakers we would not otherwise be able to bring to you on a moment's notice to discuss timely topics. Today, we're extremely excited to bring you our speaker, Rob Quartel, who will tell us about an obscure maritime law called the Jones Act. The format from our past 2 meetings has been so successful, the executive committee decided to continue with the format today. Club member Charlie Ranson will lead a question and answer following the speaker's remarks. We'll be taking questions received online from our members. Be sure to mark your calendars for our next program on June 23rd. We will have the Honorable Laurel Lee, Florida Secretary of State. She will speak about cybersecurity as it relates to the upcoming election. We are planning to have both an in-person meeting at the Governor's Club and a virtual meeting for those who want to attend and those that don't feel comfortable with an in-person meeting. Be on the lookout for upcoming email blast, as registration will be on a first-come, first-served basis to members who are current on their dues due to capacity limitations with COVID-19. Also look out for ECHO newsletters to keep you up to date on future speakers. I'd like to take a moment and thank our club sustaining members who provide additional financial support to the club each year. Please pat yourself on the back and thank you for your support. I also want to take a privilege from the speaker's podium just to recognize the Proctor family. As I understand, a longtime member of the club, Theo Proctor, passed recently. Prayers to the Proctor family. I will now introduce Charlie Ranson. Charlie is a longtime member of the club and an international trade and development consultant and contractor. Charlie will introduce our distinguished speaker, but first I will leave the screen to be socially distant from Charlie.
Thank you, Bill, for that introduction. Today, we are privileged to welcome Rob Quartel, a former member of the U.S. Maritime Commission appointed to that position by President George H.W. Bush. Rob is an internationally recognized expert in matters related to national maritime and transportation security policy, and he will shed light for us today on the state of the U.S. maritime industry as it relates to Florida's economy and to our national defense preparedness. Rob is a highly successful entrepreneur with experience in the startup of more than a half-dozen companies. And he is also a dedicated public servant. Years before artificial intelligence invaded our public consciousness, Rob founded, and he served until recently as chairman of, Intellex Incorporated. Based in McLean, Virginia, Intellex provides advanced autonomous decision support technologies and applied risk and decision analytic tools that are widely deployed across a broad spectrum of businesses, including business interests, including homeland security, legal compliance, food and product safety, and business performance. Rob is a 9th generation Virginian, but he also is one of us, a Floridian. Rob's family moved to the Orlando area when he was a child, when his father came down to be part of the fledgling U.S. space industry. And he graduated from Edgewater High School before moving on to Rice University with aspirations of becoming an astronaut. Rob realized shortly thereafter that he did not enjoy flying, and so that short-circuited that goal, and he became a biology and environmental sciences major at Rice University. From there, he became a charter class member of Yale School of Organization and Management. Rob has also served on White House staff. He has been a senior policy advisor to 2 presidential campaigns, and twice he has sought public office in Florida to represent the U.S., to represent Floridians in Congress, first in 1982, running against Bill Nelson for a congressional seat, and subsequently in 1992, in a U.S. Senate campaign where he contested the Republican primary against Bill Grant. In that contest, Rob was endorsed statewide by 21 of 23 public daily newspapers. It is now my pleasure to introduce Rob Quartel to this meeting of the Economic Club of Florida to enlighten us on the challenges, the obstacles, and the opportunities that affect this industry that is so essential not only to the U.S., but to the state of Florida. Rob, welcome to Tallahassee from your home in Gwynns Island, Virginia.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. I wish I were in Florida today. It would be a lot warmer. We're having one of those 70-degree days. I'm delighted to be here. Just a little bit of history. Where I am sitting today was the heart of the maritime construction industry up till about 1850. We have very tall pine trees up my window, about 110-foot straight tall pine tree, which could be, which would have been used for mast. But in the 1850s, so in the 1850s, the U.S. was one of the biggest shipbuilders on the planet, and this area of the country on the Middle Atlantic was one of the biggest shipbuilding areas in the United States. But then came the advent of steam and paddle wheels and everything else, and that was the end. And it was sort of represents the way shipbuilding has gone in the United States too, which is it has ups and downs, but in fact, we're pretty pathetic at shipbuilding, and all for reasons which I'll talk about in a few minutes. Florida is a maritime state. I think we all know that. It's the value of imports and exports through all of the international gateways in the state is upwards of about $160 billion annually. Waterborne trades just under $100 billion. 15 deepwater ports, about 115 million tons of cargo, almost 40 plus million tons of increase in imports, roughly 19 million cruise passengers, and as I said, about $100 billion in value of trade, and just under about 1 million jobs in the state of Florida are associated with the maritime industry. What I'm going to talk about today is a little bit about international trade and a little bit about Florida, but mostly about a law which is the thorn in the side of consumers and business people all across the country, and in a handful of places in particular, Puerto Rico, Alaska, Guam, but which exists for reasons which are somewhat different than what we are told by its supporters. So as I think most of you know from the description, I served as U.S. Federal Maritime Commissioner during the Gulf War, and in 1990 to 1992, and I was able at that point to have a number of terrific conversations with the military and the Transportation Command and all the forces moving goods. And you know, the story is that we moved in the course of 45 days as much cargo as the equivalent of a city the size of Alexandria, Virginia, which is actually a pretty good sized, middle-sized city. We like to believe, or at least the Merchant Marine likes to believe, that there was a vast armada of American ships doing it, American ships and sailors, and most of these were Jones Act, and I'll tell you about that in a second, and was hugely successful. But in fact, Our merchant marine was only a small part of that vast sea lift of almost 500 ship movements. About 45% was on foreign flag ships with foreign crews. About 80 merchant marine ships carried hundreds of thousands of tons for sure, but they never went into the war zone. They stopped in places like Singapore and the UAE and Haifa in Israel in order to offload their cargoes onto foreign flag ships, which actually took them a far more dangerous journey into the war zone to supply Americans. So while the sea lift was a massive, massive success, really the biggest in history, our merchant marine was a distant piece of that. And the law I'm going to talk about today, which its supporters say is for the benefit of creating a vast and mighty American commercial fleet available for use in times of war to provide shipyards available at a moment's notice to build ships, was barely there. Out of those 400 and some trips, only one Jones Act ship actually went into the war zone itself, and about 8 or 10 got part of the way and offloaded onto other vessels. So that is a massive failure. So what is the Jones Act? The Jones Act was, its supporters like to say, is really the oldest law on the American books. The first law passed by the Continental Congress was a law governing shipping in the United States coastal waters. And it required essentially that most of those ships be U.S. flagged, meaning they had American sailors, American ownership. But the Jones Act itself is a section of a little section of a big law, the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, which reached its 100th birthday last week, which, among other things, it was mainly written after World War I. And I'll tell you why. As we approached World War I, there was no longer a substantial American merchant marine. We had lost out to competitors from other countries. And so we really had to rebuild the whole thing, lock, stock, and barrel. We bought ships off the world market. We built ships. We threw them into the war. And by the end of the First World War, we had one of the biggest fleets of ships in the history of the planet. And so the Congress tried to figure out what to do with them and how to recreate this merchant marine system, which didn't exist. And so they addressed shipbuilding. They addressed the need for what they call a ready reserve. The thesis was that if we had a merchant marine with lots of ships floating around the planet, when we had a war, they would be available for us to be able to move cargoes. And of course, it would also have sailors for use in the war and everything else. So they created the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, which, among other things, subsidized shipyards and created a variety of tax devices and other things. One section of the law, the Jones Act, Section 27, was specifically written, which pulled a lot of pieces of that together in what has become one of the most onerous and useless provisions of any law that I can think of. And for those of you who think of Washington as the swamp, I actually do a radio a podcast called Explaining the Swamp, and this is without a doubt one of the worst things that ever came out of it. But in any case, the Jones Act essentially requires that in order to sail a ship from one point in the United States to another, not just a port, but a point, and that becomes important later on for those of you in energy and interested in the environment and things like that, you have to be in a ship built in the United States, owned by American company, manned by American sailors. That is a provision which is unique across the planet. Many countries require that their coastal trades be on vessels that are owned and manned by their own sailors, although very few would say 100%. Most of them have a mix. You can have a mix of foreign crew in that, but almost none, and certainly no major seafaring nations require that you have the ship built in that country. And there's a reason for that. which is ships are expensive, and like many capital assets, there are places that build them well and places that don't. So I'll return to that in a bit too. But supporters of the law say that it was for national security purposes. And in fact, the section itself really wasn't written for national security purposes. It was written by Senator Wesley Jones and inserted on the floor of the Congress without a debate or committee hearing and passed by voice vote. And he did it because he was from Washington State, had a railroad and shipping companies coming out of Seattle that wanted to compete up to for the Alaskan trade then. And again, this is around 1918, 1920, after World War I. And they found that they were competing with Chinese ships. So Chinese ships could sail to Alaska from across the ocean much cheaper than the ships who started out in San Francisco. So he wanted to preclude them from going up to the territory of Alaska. And then some ships, in order to get around the existing law of the time, were sailing up to Canada and putting the cargo on a train and then moving it to Alaska from there. So he wrote this specifically to preclude all competition with his ships and his railroads coming out of the Pacific Northwest to Alaska. And Alaskans noticed and considered it a set of chains and called it that for years and years. And it's still highly contentious. Alaska's politicians, ranging from the late Senator Ted Stevens to Sarah Palin, have all decried the Jones Act. Governor Wally Hickel, who was in the Nixon cabinet, Secretary of Interior, hated it. And about 20 years ago, when we formed a coalition to revise the act, Wally Hickel was one of the first to jump on board. Ted Stevens, on the other hand, acted like a typical politician, which is when he was in Alaska, he decried the law and about what it did to Alaska, mainly raising prices and restricting crude oil exports. And then when he went back home, then he went back down to Seattle where the lobbyists were and raised himself a ton of money. So that is the story of politicians in a nutshell. So, you know, what the supporters of the law like to say is that there's about 1 billion tons of cargo carried on Jones Act ships every year. There's some 40,000 ships, 500,000 jobs, hundreds of billions of dollars to the U.S. economy. And what they forget to tell you is that, in fact, it does none of these things. And they like to tell you it's a mainstay of national security. Well, so the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, plus the Jones Act, intended to build up a new big fleet in shipbuilding. By World War II, it had essentially no impact. You know, shipbuilding had declined substantially again. The fleet had declined substantially again. And we had to rebuild all that through the war. And again, after World War II, we had a similar issue, which is we had a lot of new ships that they turned around and flipped over to the commercial services and commercial fleets in the United States. And so we kind of rebuilt it through the wars, but again, it failed time after time. And again, we reached the Gulf War in 2003 and 4, and again, we had no substantial merchant marine. It had dropped from thousands of ships in 1950 after the World War II down to just a handful, and today we have about under 100, I think it is, maybe 88 or 89 ships today, most of which, as it turns out, are oil ships, oil tankers, which are useful in a military conflict, but they're hard to take out of service. They're pretty busy, and the oil companies don't like to let the government take them while they're trying to sell their oil for the war. So, so let's talk a little bit about the impact of the Jones Act on some things you know about. You probably have recalled after Hurricane Maria, Puerto Ricans complained about this obscure shipping law. Well, that was the Jones Act, and they complained because they felt that it had historically raised the prices substantially, which in fact it has. But they also complained because they felt it was getting in the way of their effort to rebuild. and it was. And so the Jones Act, which is, so its supporters say, is meant to help us in emergencies, was suspended for about the 15th or 20th time in the last 70 years, and about the 10th time in the last 2 decades, several of those for hurricanes, because in fact, in time of emergency, this law meant for emergencies becomes the problem, not the salvation. So, so let's talk about some of the things supporters say. Well, they say it supports 40,000 ships. Well, it supports 40,000 vessels, of which 3/4 are barges, which can't sail in deep water and are virtually useless for international trade, and about 5,500 tugs and towboats and small kinds of boats, and only about 89 or so, as I said, actual ships. And the distinction is really important. You know, almost all international trade, 98%, goes on ships. And in the United States, that international trade produces about $1 out of $4 in GDP, and roughly 1 out of 4 jobs is associated with international trade. And every single ship in trade bringing cargo to and from the United States is an international ship. Not a single one is a U.S. flag, much less a Jones Act U.S. flag ship. Jones Act ships, deepwater ships, self-propelled, operate today only from the U.S. to Hawaii, U.S. to Guam, U.S. to Puerto Rico, U.S. to Alaska. The Virgin Islands, U.S. territory, when the Danes sold it to the U.S., they were smart enough to require that the Virgin Islands be exempted from the Jones Act. And so their prices are lower. And now why prices? You know, I've mentioned that several times. Well, here's what the Jones Act does. First of all, it requires that you build ships in U.S. shipyards. U.S. shipyards, by and large, don't build commercial ships. Something like 80+% of all ships and shipyards, there are only about 6 major yards left in the U.S., build their vessels for the military. They build subs and aircraft carriers and DDGs and all of these things, but they don't build for the commercial fleet. The remainder of smaller yards, which build for a commercial fleet, have built something like 7 or 8 large ships in the last decade or so. The ships they built in the last several decades are primarily oil tankers for use in the Alaska trade, which is required, unfortunately. You know, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline Act required that all crude oil out of Alaska go, no matter where, on American ships, which is fine in and of itself, except they also have to be built in the U.S. And because U.S. shipyards don't build a lot of commercial ships, they don't get any experience in it. And so a typical ship built in the United States will cost anywhere from 4 to 6 to 7 times more than a ship built in one of the competing countries, Korea, Denmark, China, Japan. And it's not because Americans live better. American shipbuilders are actually paid less than Japanese and Danish and Korean shipbuilders. So it really is a management issue and a business issue of they don't have any experience in building them, and it would take a long time to get that in order to have a big series of shipyards of ships. So American ships cost a lot more. They are in many ways technologically inferior, and I suspect that's going to be a further impediment at some point. The American fleet, because American ships cost so much, is never replenished. The average Jones Act ship in an American-built, manned-owned, operated ship is almost twice as old as the oldest average foreign ship. And that's because foreign ships can be replenished, rebuilt at a much lower cost. And so ship owners do it. And why is this important? Because ships have a lifespan expectancy of about 20 years. And if they go longer than that, they become less and less safe, and the engine technology and fuels and all of these things also make them environmentally inferior. So So first of all, the issue and price is ships cost a lot in the United States. Well, then the next big component of cost is labor, and American labor probably costs 40% more than most competitive foreign labor, and that is because they are paid more and for shorter work hours. So some number of years ago, almost 30 years ago, when I was first looking at this, an MIT study suggested that a typical captain on a merchant marine ship would earn upwards of $350,000 a year for 6 months' work on a ship. And that included all of his benefits. So that's a pretty hefty pay. And a merchant mariner will earn upwards, just a seaman style merchant mariner, not an officer, could earn upwards of 100,000 or more, again, for about 6 months' work. Now, it's dangerous and nasty work, but they are paid more than most crews. Most crews from around the world and most ships from around the world are paid somewhat lower wages, of course. So again, why does it cost more to ship in a Jones Act ship? Well, because ships cost more to build, because we're not good at it. Number two, because our crews are more expensive. And frankly, number three, because the fact of American ownership and the fact that you're required to buy it in American yards and it's so expensive means that banks don't like to finance American ships. So, you know, if you're out there buying a small container ship for $100 million well, actually a small container ship might be $35 to $50 million, or an oil tanker, $35 million, somewhere else in the world, banks are happy to finance that. But when you go and say, I want to buy and sell the same ship for over 3 or 4 or 5 times that price, they don't want to do it. So the Jones Act adds costs all across the economy, but most particularly in energy. So when you go to the gasoline, get gasoline for your car, you're paying anywhere from 2 to 3 to 4 cents more per gallon, directly attributable to Jones Act costs of shipping. If you live in Puerto Rico, you pay substantially more, and it's been estimated 20 to 60% more depending on the goods in Puerto Rico. The same thing in Hawaii for goods coming from the US. So now, this is an interesting twist. Jones Act supporters do things, they do a lot to misdirect the conversation. So they'll say, well, gee, if you got rid of the Jones Act, all of these Chinese ships could come into the United States and all of these other foreigners. Well, actually, the Jones Act can't prohibit ships from coming into the United States. That's trade. So technically, a Chinese barge could go on up the Mississippi, where about half of the so-called Jones Act fleet lives, or into the Great Lakes, although they don't. A Jones Act ship can go, a non-Jones Act, a Chinese ship, British ship, you know, whatever, can go anywhere in the United States because that's how we do trade. They just can't carry cargo from one point to the other, which reduces the economic viability of shipping. So all of these costs make shipping a lot more expensive than it is in international trade for those who have to live by the Jones Act. So you don't see coastal ships coming up and down the coast of the United States that are American. You don't see really super container ships coming in because they require what's called lightering. The largest ship on the planet today is bought by an international company, OOCL. It is 2,400 feet long, almost half a mile. It's 350 some feet wide, carries 21,000 20-foot equivalent containers, and it has a draft of about 16 and a half meters would be 30, 48, almost 52 feet basically. And there are not many ports in the United States that can handle that, and certainly none in Florida. But if they could, they would need to take the containers off of that ship and put them on smaller ships, which would then distribute them up and down the coast and to other parts of the nearby world, which is the way it works in every other country in the planet except in the United States, because we can't afford to build ships that are solely for the purpose of redistributing containers from big ships. Here what happens is the container ships, which are about half that size, are now coming in to ports in the U.S., a handful of ports, 10,000 containers. And those containers are offloaded onto trucks and trains and then redistributed around the country. And that sounds pretty logical. We're pretty used to that. But you know, in the rest of the world, shipping is the cheapest means of transportation, which is why they redistribute them by ships first and then trucks and trains second. So the funny thing about the Jones Act, which is supposedly meant to save shipping, is that in fact, it actually takes cargo off of ships and puts them on trucks and trains because it's too expensive to carry them on Jones Act built ships. So what about time of war? And I'm going to pull this to a close pretty quickly here because I think my goal here is to tantalize you a bit and to talk about answer questions, because that's really more fun, because there's an aspect of this which sounds like, well, why shouldn't we require that we build ships here and have American sailors and all the rest of that? And I mean, how do we make America great again if we don't do that? In fact, it doesn't make us great. It actually undermines other industries. So the Jones Act shipping costs have gotten so high that you need various kinds of ships for various jobs. So you know about oil tankers, and now you know about container ships. But you probably didn't know that there's ships that are specialized to carry salt, and you know there's ships specialized to carry minerals and metal, and there are ships to carry cattle and grain and all that. Except we don't have any of those anymore. We don't have cattle carriers. We don't have grain carriers. We don't have salt carriers at a decent price. So all of those industries have stopped carrying, they're moving their cargoes on American Jones Act ships because there aren't any at any price, because it costs too much to build these ships in American shipyards. In fact, there's a kind of funny story about cattle. Some years ago, about 20 years ago, I headed a group that was intended to see if we could reduce the Jones Act impact, primarily by eliminating the build requirement that you build in the US. That would have taken a big chunk of cost away, letting people buy ships cheaper on the open market. Like you may know or may not know that airplanes and trains and trucks can all be bought overseas from anyone, cheapest source, but ships cannot. And there's a big difference, obviously, in the way they end up operating. But it turns out in Hawaii, Hawaii's been trying to create branded cattle. They have cattle herds that are very high end. They're what you call Wagyu, meaning sort of like the Japanese Kobe beef, and they wanted to brand them as Hawaiian cattle. And they grow on these beautiful hillsides, in Hawaii, on these islands. And some number of years ago, the Hawaiian cattlemen decided they used to bring their grain from the mainland on grain carriers, as expensive as it was, to fatten the cattle up, just like they do here in the United States. And at some point, that was the end of the grain carriers, so there were no more, and they couldn't do it. So they ended up leasing cattle carriers to take the young calves back to the United States across the ocean, and then railroad them into fat stock yards in the West, fatten them up, and then send them on to U.S. markets. Well, eventually they could no longer get cattle carriers. So there are two shipping lines that serve Hawaii, Matson Navigation and one other, and Matson's the primary. Matson offered to put the cows, these little calves, into containers. And you've all seen a truck with a container on the back of it, and you imagine putting a bunch of little calves in one of those things and carting it across several thousand miles of ocean for several weeks, and what that would be like. And so they call these cow-tainers, not containers. And they tried it a bit, and the cattlemen didn't like the outcome. They had the death rate went up 2 or 3 times. It was small, but they don't like to lose them. They're expensive. And it just didn't work for them. So they ended up flying these calves on empty backhauls of jumbo jets from Hawaii to the United States, cows with frequent flyer miles. So this actually happened and still happens. And so this is one of the distortions of the Jones Act. One last thing, I started by talking about the impact of the law on sea lift in the Gulf War. And, there are several pillars of the defense assertion. One is that we need to have a commercial fleet that can supply sea lift in a time of war, and we do. But in the Gulf War, we were happy to use military sea lift as well as foreign ships. And just to put a little fine point on that, the Secretary of the Navy last year got in trouble because he said he had 600 million or 400 million to buy ships, but he could buy a lot more. That's what it would cost him for each ship, 400 to 600 million that he would need in a U.S. shipyard to carry commercial cargoes, essentially, to troops, resupply cargo. He said, I could buy a lot more at 30 million a piece if I could buy them off the international market. And he is right. He could buy 20 ships for the price of one U.S. But in any case, so the first pillar is to have a vast and mighty fleet, and we don't have that. And because we don't have that, we don't have sailors to sail all of these other ships. The Maritime Administrator estimated that he would be about 1,800 sailors short if he had to do a sea lift today for an all-out war. And that was assuming that everybody who was eligible for sea lift, meaning they had to have a certain kind of license, deep water license and experience, that everyone showed up. And just to put another fine point on that, the average age of a merchant mariner today is up in the 50s. There are people who were called up in the Gulf War who were in their early 80s. So, it's not exactly a vibrant fleet with a vibrant young staff of merchant seamen. Most graduates of our merchant marine academies cannot find jobs on American merchant marine ships because they simply don't exist. So not enough ships, therefore not enough sailors, not enough jobs for merchant mariners. And of course, the shipyards don't build commercial ships because they don't get enough orders because they cost too much to build them. It's a vicious cycle. So this is a huge problem. It's a law most people only hear about when there's a hurricane. And people ask themselves, why do we have it? Well, that's the question. Why are we shackling ourselves with a law that's 100 years old, written for a war that took years to ramp up, before jets, before fast ships, before drones, before nuclear weapons, before wars happened in 3 days and were over in 6? That's the big question. And so many of us who both support American merchant marine sailors and the jobs and think we need a fleet and need it for commerce, almost all of us ask ourselves, why do we still have a law written in 1920 for a world and a planet and an economy that was a totally different era? So with that, I'm going to leave this and let my minders over there on the other side grab the screen back, and I hope you have some questions.
Thank you, Rob, for that. I think we have questions, and I think you have already anticipated a number of those. We do have a hard stop at 1 p.m., so I think there are probably 2 questions left that I want to raise with you that are one that's Florida specific and another that is very much forward-looking.
Yeah.
The first is, are cruise ships, which is a major industry in Florida, are cruise ships covered under the Jones Act? The maritime trade unions say that it saves a domestic industry that moves more than 100 million passengers and $400 billion worth of goods between ports on an annual basis. What is your answer to that question about cruise ship coverage?
Well, the law does affect Florida in a couple ways. One is, you're right, the cruise industry, and the other is actually, interestingly, fuel and natural gas, liquefied natural gas, which I'll talk about in a second. But it's not technically the Jones Act that covers cruise ships. It's the Passenger Vessel Act, which is a sister law, same requirements, American built, bought, manned, owned, operated, American. And there's another one, the Dredging Act, which also suppresses dredges. We can't get enough dredges, which is a big problem in Florida and all around the country for dredging our harbors for these big, deep ships and being able to participate in the global economy. So there are these two laws. Most ships that operate out of passenger ships, what the Jones Act does is, you've heard of cruises to nowhere. The interpretations are pretty obscure and varied. Most cruise operators out of Florida are actually foreign owned and foreign built. We have really, to my recollection, built only one major passenger vessel in years. And the last Jones Act vessel was, I think, built in the early 1960s, the Jones Act passenger ship, a big one, meaning a big, deep draft ocean ship. But major cruise lines are all foreign owned. When we recently had the CARES Act after, in response to the COVID-19 crisis, you probably read that these companies could not get money for their employees, even though they're employing a bunch of Floridians and others, because the companies themselves are owned by international interests. And they do that because they can't afford to buy American ships. So they do all sorts of things to get around the law. And I mentioned LNG. Florida is out of Jacksonville is one of those places. Crowley is a maritime company, American Jones Act company that operates in Florida and the Gulf Coast and oil tankers and other things. But they also operate ships that go to Jones Act ships that go to Puerto Rico, and they like to tout that they have LNG ships. Well, LNG is a big deal, because we cannot, in Boston, they cannot get American LNG. LNG production in the U.S. has skyrocketed. It's a clean fuel. We like to use it, but we actually have to import it in most parts of the United States and export what we make, because we don't have any LNG carrier ships, very big specialized ships that cost $300 or $400 million in the best of circumstances that qualify for U.S. flag or Jones Act, because we're not building them here in the U.S. And Crowley likes to say that they're an LNG system over there, and that's about 1,000 cubic meters or something on their ships, but it's 1,000 times that on an actual LNG tanker. So,
okay. You've talked about obsolescence and the high cost of the U.S. fleet and other related issues. Given your vantage point, do you see anything on the technology front that you think is promising?
Well, the maritime industry, it's a good question. The maritime industry is actually has become recently the focus of a lot of venture capital in the country. I have a theory, which is that the big venture capital firms have so much money, they don't know what to do with it, so they're looking for a new vertical. And I've been involved in venture capital myself, and in fact, am involved in trying to do a maritime center of excellence up here in the Middle Atlantic. But yes, there are new technologies, autonomous ships. Of course, it's not just the cost of a crewman or the cost of the ship that makes U.S. ships not so competitive. Our manning laws, most U.S. ships have to have 21 sailors on them. So you multiply that times each cost. Well, the Japanese have been sailing ships with 8, 10, 11 sailors, semi-autonomous ships for 25 or 30 years. The Navy just launched its first autonomous ship. And I expect that technology is going to come into play all across the planet. So meaning that you won't have to have necessarily a crew, although I suspect most companies will want to keep some crew. But we're also seeing a lot on clean fuel. The industry has made a major effort to reduce SOx and NOx pollution. Interestingly, the maritime industry per unit produces less pollution. They're the biggest polluter, single polluter, out there on the coast of the various countries, because they concentrate it in port cities. So they have taken major steps to reduce the pollution, which gone in this year. That's important. We're seeing new skins. I've seen, things like new types of metal and other skins on the ship that prevent barnacle growth and keep the ships clean. There are all sorts of new technology. One of the disadvantages we have is that our shipyards are not used to building what you call the complex curves, bending the steel for these hulls that we see in Asian shipyards in Denmark and places like that. So whole variety of technologies. There's people are using drone technologies for use with ships. There's a whole lot going on, and I think there's not a lot going on in ship construction in the U.S. The fact that they have a captive defense market means that they're not highly innovative they don't have to be innovative. Defense ships take a very, very long time to build, and that's one reason they cost so much money too.
Okay, I think we've pretty well wrapped it up. I will turn it back over to Bill Moore to close the meeting. Rob, thank you so much for sharing with us your experience and your expertise and your observations on this.
Well, and I want to recommend to everyone at the club that they pick up a book called The Matthews Men, which talks about it was written 2 or 3 years ago. That's my county here is Matthews County, and more merchant mariners died per capita here than in any other part of the United States and than any other service. So it talks about the heroics of these men who jumped off the crab boats and the small boats and the tenders and the tugs and the small commercial vessels and went to World War II and were so critical in supplying our troops in that period. And the merchant mariners today continue in that tradition, but they have a harder row to hoe. The Matthews Men.
The Matthews Men. I'll find a copy. Thank you.
Rob, thank you for your time today. And on behalf of our membership and the board of directors, I think that was an extremely insightful presentation. And I know that you took time out of your schedule to, one, practice, but also to be present today. So thank you.
It's great. Love to be in Florida, even if only virtually.
Well, and it is beautiful here in Tallahassee today, but thank you again. And I want to remind the members that our next program is next Tuesday. It'll be both virtual and in person. So we look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks again, Rob.
Thank you.
This is the Economic Club of Florida, a distinguished platform for discussion of the major national issues of the day.